This is JadeCast, your gateway to traditional martial arts and Chinese culture. Brought to you by your host, Shifu Jonathan Bluestein. Hey there, folks, and welcome back to the podcast. Today I have a somewhat controversial topic to discuss with you, which is the role of weight training or resistance training in the practice of martial arts, and especially that of the internal martial arts, because these are the martial arts which I practice and teach personally, and that are also relevant to a lot of our listeners. So, when we talk about weight training, actually we should be talking about resistance training, because weights are just one form of resistance. We can actually get resistance from our body weight, right? With push-ups, pull-ups, we are not necessarily using any weights. We can use rubber bands. We can use the resistance of water. We can even use the resistance of one muscle against the other inside of the body, as in isokinetic training, such as we see in practices in traditional martial arts like some types of har qigong and sanchin kata. So let's put it all under the category of resistance training rather than just weight training. And weight training is just one type of resistance training. All right, so there are many pros and cons for resistance training for martial artists and otherwise. We have to consider a lot of things. And I want to start with some massive benefits that you should know about. So first of all, there are just piles of studies. I'm talking thousands and thousands of scientific studies from the past century demonstrating without a shadow of a doubt that resistance training is really good for your health. Really, really good. I mean, that's what we ought to be doing in a natural setting as human beings. Whether you look at more ancient human beings in the role as hunters and gatherers, or you think of human beings as farmers in slightly closer civilizations to ours, or still to this day, these people were engaged not just with aerobic training, but with anaerobic training that you gain from resistance training. I mean, think about it. You want to build a house. You have to build with your own hands. You have to haul logs and rocks and hammer and saw and hunt animals and carry those animals, dig in the earth. People, they had plows to work their fields, but they did not immediately know that they could use farm animals to like a bull or an ox to move that plow. Initially, or when people just didn't have those animals, they would plow the fields themselves, either manually or with metal instruments, but they would go through the fields, and that's quite a training. I mean, imagine that's very similar, often kinetically, to moving a car. Have you ever had your car break down? You had to move it. Imagine that you have to move this thing uphill and do so for several hours a day. Imagine the strength and the stamina you're gonna get out of this thing. So that's ancient humans for you, and even not that ancient. I mean, 200, 300, 500, 1,000 years ago, there were quite a lot of people with that kind of strength and stamina. And trust me that this sort of practice has certainly been keeping those people away from their doctors, which weren't numerous anyway, and probably often not close by, but this type of resistance training keeps you healthy. For starters, it moves your blood about, right? And increased blood flow is very important for our health. How about lymph? Lymph is this fluid that's very important for our immune system that's not often enough discussed by lay people. And we need that lymph to move so we can treat all sorts of external pathogens, be there viruses, bacteria, or otherwise, or even cases of poisoning. But guess what? Unlike blood, which is in part moved by the heart and in part by the electrical activity in our bodies. The lymph fluid does not have a pump or anything in particular to move it. Lymph moves throughout the body when we move. It's our movement and our exchange of fluid inside the body that pushes the lymph around. The blood, but also the muscles, the tendons, the other connective tissues, all of this movement inside the body pushes the lymph here and there. So that's a big problem, by the way, when people get sick and they get bedridden for too long. Their lymph is not moving enough. So people who are bedridden for more than a few days, or even for more than 2 or 3 days, it's very important that they self-massage or have someone else massage them. And this is a wisdom that Western medicine and Oriental medicine knew very well in the past. Unfortunately, not very common in hospitals nowadays. But I digress. Let's go back to the point. So you do resistance training, you're going to move that blood, you're going to move that lymph, which is something you're going to get out of martial arts training as well, but not exactly in the same manner. And also because resistance training tends to be more intense, especially if it's anaerobic. Anaerobic means without oxygen, means you can't do it for a very long time. Aerobic is something you can do for more than 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, roughly speaking. It means that it works more of your cardiovascular system. It works your heart and your lungs more than other things. The tension and the strain on the muscles is not as great. Compared with anaerobic training, typically something you can't do for over a minute. You can repeat the same activity or the same movement for over a minute. That means the greater strain, your heart is strained, but in terms of what it's going to build primarily your muscles, your bones, and your connective tissues. That's what you're targeting there. That's anaerobic as compared with aerobic. Aerobics, of course, we all know is swimming, running, and for prolonged periods of time. Sprinting is anaerobic. Anyhow, going back on topic, so the intensity of squatting a weight that you can only squat for 10 times is not the same as practicing martial arts for 1.5 hours, 2 hours, 3 hours, right? The martial arts practice at times tends to be more aerobic, and the resistance training tends more towards the aerobic side usually. All right, so other very important benefits. It helps our bodies become stronger as we get older or remain stronger. Once a person is past their 70th year, it's very easy to get a minor injury that's going to spiral out of control, limit our movement, and eventually kill us within months or years. What happens, an older person would try to lift something that's too heavy for them, would slip, they would dislocate something, break their hip, break their knee, something like that's going to happen. Then they're going to get bedridden, their lymph and blood wouldn't be moving enough, they'll develop an illness, that something's going to start being chronic, other chronic things are going to get worse, and it's well known for people past their 70th, 75th, 80th year, very commonly if they break their hip and such, they're going to be underground in a matter of 5 years often. That's a terrible reality, but it's well known. So we don't want this to happen to us, and we are all going to eventually, hopefully, reach an older age, and we want to keep healthy. So it's important that we keep our balance and our stamina, and those are things that martial arts help us with. But we also want to make sure that if we have to lift something heavy or to bend over or be able to suddenly, move our car. What happens if our car breaks down? We're 70, 75 years old. Then, if we've been doing some measure of resistance training in the years or months prior, especially if we've been doing it for decades, it's far less likely that we're going to injure ourselves. Now, also for martial arts, again, I'm talking all the pros here. We're going to get to the cons soon, and you see how we're going to balance those things. For the martial arts, eventually, a person is going to get powerful enough that they can hurt their joints. It naturally happens if someone trains for at least a few years, especially trains for decades. The power you develop that you can put into your joints, especially with striking movements, is going to be far more than what can be produced by a layperson. And you better have strong bones and connective tissues and muscles holding those joints really well together, that they could support that type of power. As it often happens to martial artists, they develop a certain measure of power that some areas or parts of their bodies cannot sustain. And there are very famous examples. Mike Tyson, very famous boxer, now making a comeback in his 54th year, very impressive. He broke his hand, I think, twice in street fights, famously so, because he wasn't wearing a glove and he wasn't accustomed to hitting someone with his mighty power without a glove. Now, was that a necessity? Well, not necessarily, because someone like Mike Tyson could have actually trained some methods of iron palm, for instance, from traditional martial arts. And if he had done that for a year or two or three, it's unlikely that he would have broken the bones off his palm. However, because Mike Tyson is a boxer and boxing is a sport and he's accustomed to wearing gloves, he wasn't counting on having to punch someone without a glove. So things are different. So you see how a certain type of conditioning is important when you get to a measure of power. I mean, Mike Tyson is probably packing one of the history's strongest punches, right? That's a very extreme example. But you have to match the level of power that you develop with the ability of the body to deliver that power and not injure yourself. And I'm not even talking about striking other people. You can literally injure your joints, especially wrist joints, elbows, and knees with punching or kicking or doing some other very fast, very powerful movement, even if you're not hitting anybody, even if you're just moving in the air. I can tell you that it happened to me a few times, at least 20, 30 times through the years, that I was not cautious enough in holding my joints as tightly as I should have, and I almost dislocated either my elbow or my knee just practicing in the air. It is very possible, and I bet that if you listeners have been martial artists for many years, you've experienced that also. So if we do resistance training, that helps us tremendously with that notion of developing joint thickness and stability, which is very important for injury prevention. Now, it also supports our ability at times to contract our muscles more strongly. So that's very important for producing power. Either you can look at squeezing power, right? If you're gonna choke somebody, or use a certain type of a joint lock, or striking power, or whichever power is required to execute a certain technique. So that's a big plus there. Also, in terms of body mass, when you have greater body mass, of course, you can put more weight behind your movements, which makes you inevitably more powerful. And there are a lot of martial artists who are more powerful by the virtue of just having more fat on their bodies. But if we have to choose between fat, which is, as you know, much easier to gain as compared with muscle, then of course we ought to prefer muscle, all right? And there are all sorts of other advantages. I mean, you get to look good. I like that. I enjoy looking at bodybuilders, strong men, power lifters, and such. Training gives me motivation. I like those sports. I like what they do. I don't think that because it's very, very different to martial arts, there is a reason to dislike it. I've always liked it. I don't follow those sports closely necessarily, but once in a while, some figures I do know and I follow, and it's very interesting. And they are elite athletes at times, and it's nice listening to them and to their wisdom, because as elite athletes as such, they share a lot of that warrior wisdom that's very relevant for us martial artists as well. Now, with all that being said, there are quite a few challenges with the inclusion of resistance training with the martial arts. So, first of all, it can make you slower. And that's just the truth, If you look at weight categories in sports like boxing or MMA, then typically the featherweights are quicker than the middleweights, and the middleweights are quicker than the heavyweights. And even if you have a very fast heavyweight, if that heavyweight were to move to a super heavyweight category, then that person would get inevitably somewhat or a lot slower. Because when you have a greater mass, you cannot move as quickly. Now, this is a difficult predicament to contend with, because when we get slower, we also get somewhat less powerful compared with ourselves. Again, compared with ourselves, not with other people. Here's the deal. Speed contributes more to power than mass. All right? So I'll put it like I explained it in my book, Research of Martial Arts, which you should be looking into. That's a very interesting book, an international bestseller, Research of Martial Arts. So imagine that I would like to increase my power, and components in power would be speed and mass, right? How much potentially could I increase my mass? If I am, say, my height, if I am 5'6", 140 pounds, just as an example, and I would like to reach from 140 pounds to 280 pounds, the only people essentially that could double their body weight and do so primarily with muscular mass are people who are elite athletes. Again, in those sports I mentioned earlier, powerlifters, strongmen, and bodybuilders. Only in a top bodybuilding competition like Mr. Olympia or strongman competition like World's Strongest Man, you would see someone at a certain height weighing double the weight of an ordinary or a slightly muscular person of the same height. And what I mean to say by this is that you are very likely not going to increase your weight in muscular mass by a whole lot. At best, if you are to dedicate your life to a certain power sport or an aesthetic sport like bodybuilding, then maybe you would be able to increase your mass by twofold, or maybe by 2.2 or 2.3 at most. All right. So we are very limited by how much we can increase our mass. However, there is a much greater factor by which we can increase our speed. Because you take an ordinary person on their first martial arts class and you measure the speed of their punch. It would be possible for such a person over months and years to increase the speed of their punch twofold, threefold, fourfold, maybe make it 5 times faster. Now, 5 times more is more than twice more that you can do with the weight, right? So our potential for increasing speed is much more prominent than our potential for increasing mass. Now, we have already said that increasing one's body mass can make us more powerful, and that's a truth and a reality. But you can't count as much on mass like you do on speed. And also, like I said earlier, at one point, there's gonna be diminishing returns. You're gonna get to the point where you have enough, you have increased your body weight enough that this is going to begin slowing you down. And of course, that changes from person to person. So you have to be very careful in monitoring this and have a sense of, okay, if I were to do resistance training, when is it going to become too excessive as to begin slowing me down and actually diminish my power rather than increasing it? So this is one potential problem and a very important consideration for any martial artist. Now, here's another very simple consideration. Time. How much time do you have to invest in physical training? A lot of the listeners and most people who practice the martial arts do not do so for more than 3 to 4.5 hours a week. If you're in that category of people who train for 3 to 4.5 hours a week at most, then, well, most likely you don't really have that much time to put into it. So, do you really want, is it important for you to increase your muscular mass to a decent extent, to a great degree? I mean, at the least, this is going to require that you put in another hour and a half in total a week for resistance training. And if you're very serious, you can put 4 or 5 or 6 hours a week for your resistance training. But here's the question. First of all, do you have that time? Second of all, if you're going to put in 6 hours a week, and that's not including, driving to the gym and back, or maybe you have the equipment at home, or whatever manner in which you're going to do that resistance training, but often there's more time involved. If you're doing 6 hours a week training with weights or rubber bands or both, or doing body weight training or whatever, and at 6 hours a week of that and only 3 hours a week of martial arts, are martial arts really your main priority, or just like the you get what I'm saying? Martial arts becomes the sidekick for your main physical hobby, which is actually going to become resistance training. So, are you a martial artist? Well, yes and no, but you're now resetting your priorities and placing a different emphasis on this resistance training. And it's not good or bad, it's just something you need to consider. A, whether you have the time, and B, if you reschedule everything in that manner, maybe martial arts are not as important to you as some other stuff. Now, please do understand, when I speak about such things, I do speak from experience. I started in my early years doing more resistance training than I did martial arts. Then over the years, I have grown to make martial arts my main hobby, later on my profession. The weight training got less and less attention. Eventually, I gave up weight training, even though I was certified prior and I worked as a certified weight training instructor by the state of Israel. And then I found myself going back to weight training many years later in the not so recent past because of other reasons. And this is again weighing the pros and cons. But let me finish the discussion here about what's good, what's bad, what's in the middle, and how we can do it best before I get there. What else we need to consider is, why are we actually weight training or resistance training? Are we doing this to support our martial arts practice, or that's what we tell ourselves? Or is it just to beautify our bodies, sustain our health, etc., etc.? Because these are very different goals, you see. If we are to tell ourselves that we want to support our martial arts practice with resistance training, then we really don't have to do a lot of resistance training. I mean, really, you can take 3 training periods of 30 minutes a week, literally, like just take 3 days a week, maybe 1 day apart or day after day. Each time you do like 30 minutes of resistance training, that would really be sufficient. All right, especially if you're using weights and such. Because I tell you what, the best way to do resistance training for martial arts is not with weights or rubber bands or even those lovely body weight training exercises like dips, pull-ups, push-ups, sit-ups, etc. The best way to do resistance training to support your martial arts is with weapons. Why weapons? Simply because with the weapons, you can use the same body mechanics that you use empty-handed, or some very similar body mechanics. there is not a lot of gain of, okay, I'll put it differently. The power and the strength and the ability that you gain from certain movements and body mechanics does not necessarily transfer well to other movements. I'll give you an example. There are not a lot of movements which people use in the martial arts that resemble a squat or a deadlift for that matter. But squats and deadlifts are some of the most important, most useful exercises that you could practice with weights and also for your health maintenance. Again, as long as you're not being excessive. But despite being so very useful, these particular movements do not really mimic or adhere to accurately most stuff you'd find yourself doing in the martial arts. Yes, they might exercise the same muscles. I mean, in the martial arts, we use all of our body's muscles, but it doesn't mean that the movement is the same or that the kinetic energy transfer is the same, the mechanics are the same. The technique is obviously not the same, and therefore the transfer of gain that you get from this resistance training to your martial arts is going to be marginalized. It's not going to be, you're not going to get 100% from that weight training or resistance training directly into your martial arts. You're probably not even going to get 20 or 30%, all right? Because you can take someone who can squat, say 400 pounds. Well, they might not be, and these people, they could weigh 300 pounds, but it doesn't mean that they could save themselves from a proficient 150 pound martial arts fighter. There is, I mean, you need technique, you need ability, and you know what? Again, it's not going to transfer directly. The kind of power and the kind of skill, they are just different. So the benefit that you have with weaponry, which is the resistance training of choice in most traditional martial arts, is that the weapons match the body mechanics and the movements that you use in your martial art. Which is also important because you need to pick and choose the weapons that are relevant to your martial art. Some people would practice something empty-handed, but something so very entirely different with weapons that it's all only remotely reminiscent of what they do empty-handed. So it's better than nothing, but it's not optimal. Therefore, going back to the original question, why do you practice resistance training? Are you doing this to beautify yourself and sustain your health? Well, that's great. Not necessarily going to be a great contribution to the martial arts. Especially, this is very true if you're talking about isolated movements versus compound movements. I'll explain the difference. When you look at stuff like bicep curls, tricep extensions, I don't know, like wrist extensions, dumbbell flies. When you take when you lay on your back and you make like a wind flapping movement with two dumbbells in your arms. It's an exercise for your pectoral muscles and for your front deltoid, a little bit for your biceps. These things are very isolated and they're meant to induce a reaction in the body to build a greater muscular mass in specific muscle groups. These are the least useful resistance training types of exercises, the isolated exercises for martial arts training. They have the least carryover from the resistance training to the martial arts. And this is even truer if you look and examine the mechanics of resistance training exercises with machines. You have to understand, resistance machines were initially created to benefit bodybuilders who need very, very specific isolation. And these are the least useful, relatively speaking, to have a carryover to martial arts training. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not useful in general. They're good for your health, they're good for bodybuilding, they're good for other purposes. Sometimes they're very good for dealing with an injury you had, and you have to isolate certain areas in the body in order to rebalance them after you had a certain medical problem. All right, but least useful for the martial arts. Compound movements, which are movements with complex technique that involve several muscular groups, the more the better. Stuff like squats, deadlifts, pull-ups, push-ups, running, sprints, all right? Sprinting has much more of a carryover to martial arts than jogging, and that more than squatting and more than deadlifting, which is more than push-ups, which is more than bicep curls, okay? The more compound, complex the movement, the more kinetic chains it involves, the more muscle groups it involves, the more it would have a better carryover to martial arts training. So if you're interested in resistance training, but you don't care much for how you look, or you are not in need for increasing your body weight or muscular mass, then I would say a lot of the weight training is redundant. Instead, you should be practicing with weaponry. And you see, even in MMA and in boxing and Muay Thai, oftentimes, because they don't have weaponry, they would use all sorts of stuff that mimics the body mechanics or the effects of weaponry. For instance, have you ever seen these sports combative athletes standing in place and they're holding a stick or a belt, and at the end of the stick or the belt there would be a ball, and they hold the stick or the belt with the ball extended in front of them, and they're with their back to a wall, and they would move very fast left and right, and the ball would extend from the stick or the belt and would hit the wall on one side and would bounce to the other side, and then bounce it from one side to another on the wall with their back against the wall. Ever seen that exercise? That very strongly mimics the effects that you get from a lot of staff and spear movements. It's almost exactly the same. And the reason this was invented in those combat sports is to use resistance training that has more carryover to martial arts. Now, what do you do if you want to do most of your training, with weaponry or something that mimics weaponry, and you're not interested about how you look, but you still need to increase your body's muscle mass? Then you are very welcome to try to do some heavy squatting and deadlifting, which are the absolute very best exercising for increasing your testosterone levels, increasing your overall muscular mass. And then you wouldn't get too deep into powerlifting or bodybuilding territory, and you don't even have to lift too heavy. And won't get into weight training theory here, otherwise this recording is going to be 3 hours long. But essentially, you can work with slightly higher repetitions, like deadlifting and squatting with 12 to 20 repetitions per set and doing 3 or 4 sets, rather than lifting weights that you can only lift for, say, 1 to 3 to 5 times. Just work those higher repetitions, 12 to 20, or 3 or 4 sets at a time per practice, doing squatting or deadlifting or both, and that will enable you to increase your body weight if you also eat enough and you eat healthy, and you'd have more muscular mass, and the rest of your resistance training you can do for your martial arts, and then you get the benefit. And of course, some type of resistance training that you get for the martial arts is training with a partner, which is either he or she, they are living weights that you have to move around sometimes, right? So that's also very good resistance training, although we don't always have those partners around to work with. By the way, one of the big, huge differences between martial arts and weight training is that most of the technique in weight training is very simple compared with martial arts techniques, with the sole exception perhaps of bench pressing, squatting, and deadlifting that have somewhat more complex techniques, or Olympic weightlifting. That's also an exception. But besides these things that you really, really ought to learn with a certified instructor who knows he or she know what they're doing. I mean, most of the other exercises you could literally learn from a video. They're not very difficult. There are ways to do them which are more professional and would yield better results, and their levels of understanding to anything and everything, and bodybuilders have their methods and their secrets, and you can always improve. But overall, I mean, weight training is not as complex as martial arts techniques. I'm just saying, all right? So moving on to what is perhaps the biggest problem with resistance training and martial arts is that resistance training, unfortunately, has the tendency of making you stiffer. Now, I will explain to you the basic science behind this. When we do resistance training for months, and especially for years and decades, what happens is that our muscles thicken. What does it mean when we say that our muscles thicken? Well, the actual tissues of the body become thicker, but also what happens is that our muscles hold to much more water. For most humans, as adults, they can't experience something called hyperplasia. Hyperplasia is when you increase the amount of muscular cells. Generally speaking, some people are born with the tendency of having more muscular cells than other people. Same as with fat cells, all right? And fat cells also don't increase in their quantity after the age of 23 or 24 or so. So what happens is that you do not typically increase your muscle cells unless that you're one of these very, very exceedingly rare individuals. Rather, the muscular cells inflate. This is called hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is this process that you train. The muscles get those microscopic tears in them. You're actually injuring your muscles when you train them, especially with resistance training. And then muscle cells repair and they grow. And that's the process by which we become bigger. But we also increase the volume of water inside of our muscle tissues and cavities. And over time, our tendons and bones also become stronger and thicker, but in a slower process than our muscles. Which is, by the way, one of the reasons people injure themselves often with resistance training is that the muscles react much quicker and are often capable of handling bigger loads quicker than the tendons and the bones could carry. That's one problem with that sort of training. That's why you need to be monitoring your progress very closely, and it's always best to work with a professional, as in the martial arts, of course. Now, what happens when our bodily tissues inflate like that in the process of hypertrophy, and also we get more water in our muscles? That raises our muscular tone, right? And this is what happens when someone does resistance training. What happens to her or him? Their tone increases. Suddenly their muscles protrude more, they become enlarged, and they become more firm. And we like this. It's good. Yeah, it's lovely. It's nice looking. It's nice to touch. We most of us enjoy it, unless you're one of those weird people that got like a fat fetish. But all right, I mean, good on you. We're all different. So the challenge with martial arts is that when this happens, our muscles are also not as pliable and are not as soft as they were before. Now, here's the catch. On one hand, we want to be able to contract our muscles as strong as possible to produce more power. On the other hand, this is not the only factor. And although resistance training can help us develop a greater ability to contract our muscles, there is also the speed of the contraction and the length of the contraction. And I'll explain what I mean. Like I said, for myriad of reasons, when you do too much resistance training, it tends to make you somewhat slower. So that decreases the speed of the contraction. So the contraction might be stronger, but if it's slower, that counters that. Now there's also the length of a contraction. So imagine if you grab onto something, if you have like something thick next to you, like a book, try to grab the book really hard. Now, after you've already grabbed the book really hard, how much more could you squeeze onto that book? Not much, right? Because you already put most of the contraction in. Because your muscle started contracted, it can't contract a whole lot more. The more the muscle is relaxed, the greater and the more it can contract. This is called the length of the contraction. The length of the contraction is longer from a very loose muscle, very relaxed muscle, to a very stiff muscle, right? Because there is, say, a whole second or 2 seconds between being totally flaccid and full contraction, the most contraction that you could possibly make with that muscle. As opposed to, if you're a professional bodybuilder and most of the time your muscle tone is high, because the muscle tone is high, not necessarily, I give the example of a professional bodybuilder, but it happens even if you train resistance training a lot for a few months, then you're already slightly or a lot contracted all the time because your muscle tone is higher. So the length of your contraction is shorter because you can't go from totally flaccid to very contracted. You go from semi-contracted to contracted. You get what I'm saying? You're starting at the 50% mark going to 100 instead of being able to start from 0 going to 100. And the length of the contraction is very important for developing speed and for ensuring power, and in some respects is more important than the speed itself or the strength of the contraction. So you see what happens when we do too much resistance training as compared with ourselves. We are actually not just diminishing our speed, we are also diminishing the power we can produce, again, relative to ourselves, not to other people. Now, these all are very important considerations for traditional martial artists, and especially people who practice the internal Chinese martial arts, which require us to be very soft, almost flaccid, but not so. Like my Shifu Nitzan Oren always used to tell me, if you need 100 units of force, just an imaginary benchmark, you just need 100 units of force to hold your arm in the air. Our goal is to use 101, just a tiny slightly more than what is necessary. While most people, if they need to use 100 units of force to hold their hand in the air, if they're lay people, they typically use, say, 300, 400. If they're bodybuilders, they might use 1,000 because their muscular tone is already very high. Now, this becomes much more difficult if you engage with resistance training. So how do you balance? There's many types of methods that promote relaxation so you can react better to an opponent and also develop a greater capacity to deliver power. How can you balance this with resistance training? And the answer is that it's very difficult and depends on the individual's innate bodily structure, and it changes from person to person. But I'll tell you what I think. Now, generally speaking, this makes resistance training very problematic for people who practice the internal arts for their first few years of practice. Now, I started that way. When I started practicing the internal arts, I was into heavy squatting, heavy deadlifting, bench pressing, you name it. Also doing a lot of isolation exercises. And I was diminishing that sort of training. It was greatly being diminished as I got more and more into the internal arts. But I've been doing it for a number of years. And this was also my part-time profession at the time as a weight training instructor. So it took me a while to get over it. And the reason I let it go entirely, eventually, after maybe 2.5 years of practice, was that it was in the way for my development in the internal arts. It just wasn't good for me personally. My muscular tone was too high. Some muscle groups like erector spinae, the muscles at the sides of the spine that help erect the spine. Because of deadlifting, they were too stiff, and this really hindered my development and cultivation in these internal arts. And as soon as I stopped, I progressed rapidly. It helped a lot to stop with the resistance training. However, one does not necessarily need to stop entirely, even if they are beginners. And also, it would be much easier to kind of balance it out if you let the weights go and just do a little bit of body weight training here and there. If you want to keep your muscle tone and still look decent, that's not a big issue. Or again, like I suggested for a lot of people, they could do most of the resistance training with weapons, and if they're in need of increasing their lean muscular mass and just way more, they can simply engage with their martial arts, the weapons, and add a little bit of squatting or deadlifting or both. Or maybe also bench pressing, but preferably engage mostly with deadlifting and squatting, because bench pressing has a lot of diminishing returns for martial arts training, and I'll get to that soon. But all that being said and considered, I found myself in recent months, say past 6 months, going back to resistance training, both body weight, and nowadays with a lot of thick rubber bands or of different lengths and thicknesses. And one of the interesting things is, if you know your physiology and kinesiology very well, and you understand how the many weight training exercises work, with a set of several resistance bands of various lengths and thicknesses, some very hard and thick, you can actually improvise almost any type of exercise found in a gym, either with free weights or machines, using just those resistance belts. Really, you can do almost anything. That's a bit too complex to explain in a lecture, but trust me, it's feasible. You don't really need a gym. You can work with these. If you're a professional, you'd rather have a gym because you get to certain weights that you just cannot imitate with just bands. For your forearms, I have a pull-up bar and a dipping bar that I also do rows with, and all sorts of other exercises. And they have those what's called thick grips, those plastic balls or cylinders that you put on these devices, and they're very thick. So you grab something that's the thickness of the thicker part of someone's forearm. So you train your grip more intensely than you would usually. And also, granted, because of the resistance bands, don't train your grip as much as weights and the weight bars and such. But these are all sorts of specialized considerations. Now, I went back to the resistance training to check out if I would do well with these after I've been in the traditional martial arts and the internal arts for many, many years, been teaching them, etc., etc. And for now, the past few months, it's been working out fine. There is a slight effect that's negative on my training, but it's very, very, very minor. So I think right now I can balance it out. But again, for the first, I would say 5 to 10 years of someone's practice, maybe you should step off the gas with resistance training and just not touch that too much or at all, because that's not going to benefit. Okay, it's going to benefit your martial arts and your body and your health for sure, but the diminishing returns, unfortunately, are probably going to outweigh the benefits. Again, in the Chinese internal martial arts, in some traditional martial arts, but not in all martial arts. Okay, so take it with a grain of salt. Everybody's different and martial arts are different. Now, a final remark that I would like to make, which I think is very important that people understand if they're martial artists, is that our chest muscles are not as relevant to martial arts as they are to other sports. Especially in the Chinese internal arts, we are supposed to slightly concave the chest, which deactivates a lot of the activity of the pectoral muscles. All of them, the upper pectorals, the main body of the pectoralis major, that's the main bulk of the pectoral muscles, and the pectoralis minor, they're all not as much involved in martial arts as other muscular groups. Now, of course, the pectoral muscles are very beautiful to look at, and they're nice to have, and they're nice to train, but it doesn't mean that they're very useful for us in martial arts, in traditional martial arts, and especially the internal Chinese martial arts. If you study the physiology and the kinesiology of how punches are dealt and how they are energized and moved about, then you'd see that a good punch barely involves the action of these muscles, the pectoral muscles, if it does at all. And most strikes and punches should almost not involve or not involve at all those muscles. So that's why I made a caveat earlier about bench pressing, which is a very popular weight training exercise, whether with rubber bands or free weights or a weight bar or with machines. They're very good for building the musculature of your pectoral muscles and your shoulders and your triceps. But guess what? It's not so useful for the martial arts. In fact, if you're one of those people who are blessed with naturally large pectoral muscles that are very beautiful to look at, or if you happen to just be a woman with large breasts, I'm sorry to say this is going to make things more difficult with traditional martial arts, because it makes the arms have more difficulty of sliding across the chest. It's just the physical nature of things, okay? I'm not judging anyone. Beautiful pectoral muscles, large breasts, awesome, why not? But in terms of just traditional martial arts practice, they can be somewhat of a liability, a little bit at least. And with some martial arts, they make the practice almost impossible. I studied Juklum Salfred Mantis Kung Fu for many years, and I gotta tell you, this is a system that unfortunately you can barely practice in the manner in which it was intended if you have very large pectoral muscles or very large breasts. It's just going to be difficult. You might want to look into other martial arts that suit your body structure better. Hey, I mean, I'm 5'6". You don't see me on the basketball court, all right? I'm not. I mean, there were famous shorter basketball players, but generally speaking, that's not meant for my size, height, dimensions, just the nature of the sport. It's not meant to insult anybody, right? So some martial arts lend themselves better to people of, a different body structure, and that's perfectly fine. That's really fine. We're all different. We have to respect one another's differences and celebrate them, and each of us can find what they excel at through their innate inborn abilities in whichever way they're built or made. So just to say, yes, I mean, I work out my pectorals. I like it. It's fun to do. It makes you look better, but do not delude yourself into thinking this is going to be of great benefit to your martial arts, because it won't. If you are into traditional martial arts, especially Chinese internal martial arts, just do it and know that you're doing it, but don't tell yourself that it's for your martial arts, because that would be a lie. There is a lot more that can be said about this topic that I've just been talking about, of resistance training and the martial arts, but we can't get too deeply into that again in this lecture. If you'd like to learn more, then please, by all means, look into my book, the international bestseller Research of Martial Arts. And you can find it on any Amazon website, such as Amazon.com, Amazon.co.uk, Amazon.fr, etc. Just go in the search box and write Research of Martial Arts. Or you can look up another book of mine, The Martial Arts Teacher. Or you can just write my name down, Jonathan Bluestein, and get to a whole list of my best-selling books on the martial arts and other topics. Hey, if you enjoyed this lecture, please, by all means, tap that subscribe button, alright? Because we got a lot more great content coming up. This channel is updated daily with lectures, interviews, and other goodies. And there are also lots of other stuff already on the channel. You should look it up. And if you like and enjoyed that lecture that you just heard, then please, by all means, go and share the link with friends, colleagues, students, teachers, family, whomever you see fit. Anyhow, that's enough for today, folks, and I'll see you next time.